Picture this. You 3-bet ace king out of position and get called. The flop comes 9 high, and now you've got no idea what to do. Do you check and give up? Fire a c-bet and pray? Take your shirt off and spin it around your head just like a helicopter? Most players are completely lost here. So today, we're breaking down the ultimate 3-bet pot system. I'll show you how 3-bet pots differ from single raise pots, when to check and when to bet when you're out of position, and how to play in position all the way from the flop to the river so you finally have clarity on every street. This is the same system we built from 50,000 hours of data, the one over 300 of our students have used to become absolute crushers. But just to be clear, we don't make income claims or guarantees. In fact, if you think you're going to earn millions like our top students just from watching a single YouTube video, you might be delusional. What we can do though is give you the roadmap. If you're tired of bleeding money in 3-bet pots with no plan, this video fixes it. By the end, you'll know exactly what to do with ace king on that 9 high flop and every decision after. Let's jump in. All right, so first, we're gonna start with 3-bet pots out of position. And I'm gonna show you why I'm such a big fan of doing so much checking from out of position and how the players in our stable were getting into trouble before we switch to this check-heavy strategy. So we are playing 2-5 here. The button's gonna open. We're gonna 3-bet with ace king in the small blind, and the button is going to call. We're going to a flop which comes queen high, so we completely whiff here. And before we implemented this checking strategy, back when we had a stable of 25 players playing across the country, our MO was just kind of to blindly c-bet in this spot, and we would c-bet small, and what would happen was the player in position would call, and we get to a turn with showdown value, so our players would be doing a lot of checking, and then they'd face a stab here and kind of wouldn't know what to do. They'd be lost in this spot, because what happens when we c-bet on the flop, especially for a small size, our opponents are going to call too wide, and when they're in position, they don't fast play nearly as much as when they're out of position, so they're still going to have some strong hands. And then what happens when we check the turn is they're going to overstab because they're getting to the turn with just too many hands that floated the flop. But the problem is we don't have information if they're strong, they're weak, they're somewhere in between, because when we check to them, they're just going to overstab and they're going to slow play a bunch of their hands on the flop, and we just don't have any idea what's going on in this spot. But we started to realize over time, when we did a lot of checking 2 players out of position as the pre-flop raiser, they just made massive mistakes. They tended to overstab on the flop, they tended to telegraph their hand strength with their bet sizing, and they just didn't really protect their check back range. When they did check back, their range was just weak, crippled, and capped. So we just started advocating for doing a lot of checking out of position, even in 3-bet pots. But we're not just gonna blindly check with everything. There is a little bit of nuance. So let me show you when we want to check and when we want to consider c-betting ourselves when we're out of position in these 3-bet pots. All right, so once again, the button is going to open. We're gonna 3-bet ace king. The button is going to call. Flop comes 7-6-3. So this is the chart we like to use on the flop here when deciding if we're gonna bet or we're gonna check. First question I like to ask is it likely to get stabbed? And there's a couple of things that are going to go into, is this spot likely to get stabbed? Number one, is the board texture more wet and dynamic? Well, let's look at this board. This board is extremely wet. It's dynamic. The nuts could change on a bunch of turns. The more wet and dynamic the board, the more likely it is that our opponent is going to stab. The next question I would simply ask, is this opponent more on the passive side or on the aggressive side? And the more aggressive they are, obviously, the more likely it is to get stabbed. So in general, the more wet and dynamic the board and the more aggressive the opponent, the more likely this spot is to get stabbed. So in this spot, on a wet and dynamic board out of position against most players, unless they're the most passive patty in the world, I think this spot is very, very likely to get stabbed. So we see here, if the spot's likely to get stabbed, we are just checking our entire range. So in this spot, I would be checking. Let's say same spot, except now the board is ace 9 deuce rainbow. This board is very, very static. The nuts, pocket aces, are going to be the nuts on the large majority of turn cards, and the board is also dry. Not a lot of draws out there, right? So in this situation, going back to our handy dandy chart, I would say no, this board is less likely to get stabbed, right? Caveat here, if we're against a super aggro player who's just gonna monkey stab all the time, could still be checking range, that may be good. But against most players on a super static dry board, I would just say no, this board is less likely to get stabbed. Next, the question we ask once we say no, this board is not as likely to get stabbed, is the SPR greater than 15? And SPR simply means stack to pot ratio. Is the effective stack size, $900, divided by the pot, greater than 15? Well, no, we see it's about 4 point something here. So is the SPR greater than 15? In this spot, we are going to say no. And once we see the SPR here is less than 15, we see we are betting our CPFS. That means our can play for stacks hands that are just happy getting all the money right now. That may be a hand like ace 9 suited or pocket nines here, just a hand that can cooler our opponent. It's super strong hands when they have a hand like ace king or something like that. And then we're also betting our thick value, maybe a hand like ace king or ace queen, a hand that's one step down from can play for stacks, but very, very comfortable. If we go bet, 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 and our opponent goes call, 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 we just think we're gonna have the best hand a lot of the time. That's my definition of thick value. And we see we're just checking everything else, our thin value, our showdown value, our draws, our air. And we see because the SPR is significantly less than 15 here, we could start off with a small c-bet, and we could just very easily get the money in by the river, just going bet, bet, bet ourselves here. One of the advantages of checking is being able to go for that check raise to pile in money quicker. But when the SPR is so low, especially with a thick value hand, we just don't really need the check raise to be able to get in all the money easily by the river. One of the disadvantages of check raising is it actually maximizes fold equity. It makes our opponents more likely to fold. So we definitely don't want to maximize fold equity when we have a thick value hand like ace king here. Same situation when we have a can play for stacks hand on a static board. Yeah, the board's a little bit more wet, but it's still static. And dynamic versus static is going to be a much bigger indicator of if our opponent's overstabbed than even wet versus dry. Wet versus dry still matter, don't get me wrong, but dynamic versus static is going to be a little bit more important if they're going to overstab. This board is static. We see can play for stacks wants to just bet when the SPR is 15. And once again, we can just go bet, bet, bet here and quite easily get the money in ourselves over 3 streets. Let's look at a situation where the SPR is greater than 15. And we see in this hand, we start 4K effective. So we're just super duper deep. Not going to come up all that often in 3-bet pots, more for single raise pots, but want to talk about this specifically. Going back to our handy dandy chart here, we see when the SPR is greater than 15, we still want to bet our thick value. And the reason is because if we start check raising on this type of board, a static dry board in a 3-bet pot with a hand that's just thick value, we're really probably only going to get called by better a lot of the time if we start playing for stacks this deep with a hand like ace king. So just because we have a thick value hand doesn't mean we necessarily want to play for stacks. And just going bet, bet, bet here doesn't mean we can play for all the money, but we can still play for quite a bit of money when our opponent has hands like ace queen, ace jack, ace 10 suited, stuff like that, and still win a nice pot. And you see it can play for stacks hand. Now going back to our handy dandy chart, these hands now want to check when the SPR is greater than 15, because the best chance of maximizing our chance to get in all the money here is going for that big boy check raise, right? If our opponent does have a hand like ace 6 or pocket sixes or ace king or something like that, the best way to play for all of the money is go for that check raise here, and we can cooler those hands when we are this deep. So we check, our opponent is going to bet, we're going to go for the check raise, we can put in a big bet on the turn, we leave an SPR of less than 1 by the river. And like I said, when our opponent does have a hand like ace 6 or they got the last king in their hand for ace king, we're just going to be able to play a massive pot here by going for that check raise and building the pot right away. So that's why can play for stacks wants to check when the SPR is so high. And some of you may be wondering, hey, what size do we check raise here when we have a can play for stacks hand? That's a great question, and we cover nuanced stuff like that in our 5-day Basecamp. Our 5-day Basecamp is where we give you the complete roadmap and system based on 50,000 hours of data for playing pre-flop, in position, out of position, and we'll teach you how to come to a great decision in 3 questions or less. And all of the nuance that we just really can't get into in YouTube, we're gonna cover it there and give you every piece of the puzzle so you can put it all together. All right, so we've covered when to check and when to bet, but what happens when we check and our opponent stabs? What do we do then? All right, so our opponent's gonna open on the button. We 3-bet with pocket 10s in the small blind. Our opponent calls, and we are going to flop middle set here. We wanna go back to our handy dandy chart. Is it likely to get stabbed? Well, the board is wet and dynamic, so unless we're playing against the most passive patty in the world, I would say yes. So I'd be doing a whole hell of a lot of checking here because I just expect this board to get stabbed quite a bit. So we are going to check, and now our opponent stabs big. So look at this, we got a new chart. We just asked what size did they stab? Did they go big? Did they go small? Right? And on this board, our opponent stabbed for 150 into 205. In a 3-bet pot, this is going to be a big size. One note here on absolute versus relative size, I always lean more into the absolute size of the bet, right? $150 bet into a $205 pot in a 2-5 game is going to be much more significant information than if our opponent bets $25 into a $25 pot, right? Even though this is pot, 25 into 25, and 150 into 205 is less than pot, I would say that $150 bet is going to tell us much more about our opponent's hand strength than the $25 bet, right? So the bigger the pot gets, the more the absolute size of the bet matters. 150, absolutely a big stab size in a 2-5 game. And we see here we're going to have some Some hands we check raise, some hands we check call, and some hands we check fold. And when our opponent goes big, we're just not doing all that much check raising, because when they go big, they are telegraphing,
hey, I have a super strong hand.
They're not going to be doing much folding. So we're just going to check raise when we have can play for stacks and when we have our combo draws. Why are we check raising our combo draws? We talk about this a lot. And remember, the less fold equity we have, the more equity in our hand we need. And when we have a combo draw, say we have a hand like king, queen of clubs on this board, we just have a shit ton of outs to get there. Even if our opponent does have pocket tens or pocket sixes, right? We're just going to get there nearly half the time. Also, we still have a shred of fold equity. They're not just going to have sets in two pairs. They may have a hand like queen jack or king jack that we can get to fold some of the time. They may have a smaller flush draw that we can get the money in where we're dominating them some of the time, right? So going back to our chart here, we see we are just check raising our can play for stacks hands like pocket tens and our combo draws like king, queen of clubs. If we have a thick value hand, maybe a hand like pocket queens here or ace jack, we would just be check calling against this size. A hand like ace 10 suited, a thin value hand, I would be check calling as well. A high equity draw, a hand like ace 5 of clubs, I'd just be check calling here. This hand's going to have a little bit less equity than a big combo draw here. And remember, when our opponent's range is too strong, they're going to be under folding. So we just want a shit ton of equity in our hand. Ace 5 of clubs would just be check calling here with our high equity draws. In a hand like pocket nines, where we just have showdown value, when our opponent stabs this big, they're just letting us off the hook. Sure, sometimes nines is going to be ahead, but I think it's much more profitable to just fold a hand like pocket nines with showdown value here. When our opponent stabs this big, they're screaming, hey, I've got something good. So let's just exploit that fact and fold when we have showdown value. All right, now let's look at a spot versus small stabs. We're gonna 3-bet the Quigleys. Our opponent calls. Flop comes jack 9 deuce. This board is likely to get stabbed. It is dynamic and wet, so we are going to check it over. Now our opponent stabs for 70, 1/3 pot. This is going to be a much smaller stab, so we're gonna go to our handy dandy chart. What size did they stab? Well, they chose a small size. What is the board type? Back to the board. Well, this is a dynamic and wet board going back to our chart. So we're gonna see here, we got some check raises, some check calls, and some check folds. And we see on a dynamic wet board here, when our opponent stabs small, we're doing quite a lot of check raising. The reason is when our opponent stabs small on this kind of scary, wet, dynamic board, their range is just going to be far, far, far too weak. They're just not going to put enough strong hands in this size, particularly when the board is wet and dynamic. So we can just do a whole lot of check raising here. We can go much more thin for value, and we can just be raising quite a lot of our bluffs here, just because we think we have a lot more fold equity in this spot when our opponent chooses a small size on a dynamic wet board. So with our thick value hand with pocket queens here, would actually be raising just for thin value, trying to get value from our opponent's jack X, from their draws, etc. When we have a hand like can play for stacks, pocket nines would also be raising here. Combo draw like king, queen of spades, you know it, we are check raising. High equity draw like ace 5 of spades would also be check raising. Wouldn't be doing this against a big stab, but a small stab on a dynamic wet board, we can just get away with a lot of check raising because we think we have more fold equity. Even our low equity draws, a hand like king, queen of diamonds for just 2 overs and a gutter would be check raising here just because we think we've got a shit ton of fold equity. And then our showdown value, maybe a hand like pocket tens here, a hand like ace king high, we'll just be doing a lot of check calling. Think those hands are going to be good quite a lot. And here's the important point here. Even though our opponents over stab on the flop when we check to them, they massively under, double and triple barrel. So what happens is the truth serum comes out on the turn when we check call on the flop, and they just don't put in nearly enough double barrels, which is why we can check call so wide against this small size. And it's also why our stable was running into so much trouble initially when we were c-betting, was because our opponents would call too wide, then we would check to them and they would stab too wide, but they would still have all the strong nutted hands and we would just get lost in those spots. But these spots, if we check to them, sure, they overstab, but then when we check call and check again on the turn, they massively under double barrel. So we don't have to face that second double barrel. The truth serum really comes out, and this is why checking is so good. So we saw what to do with the board is wet and dynamic, but what if it's dry and static like this? So let's go back to our handy dandy chart. And in most spots that this SPR may just be coming out and betting myself here, but let's say we know our opponent is a monkey stabber. We know this guy just stabs quite a bit. So we're going to check a can play for stacks hand here, and now we face a small stab. Going back to our chart, what size did they stab? They went small. What is the board type? Static and dry. And we see when the board is static and dry, look how much we're check raising. Just our can play for stacks and our combo draw. Versus when the board is dynamic and wet, we're check raising our can play for stacks, our combo draws, our thick value, our high equity draws, our low equity draws. But when it's static and dry, we're check raising a whole lot less here. Why is that? Because we look at this board, our opponents don't telegraph their hand strength nearly as much when the board is this static and dry as they do when it's dynamic and wet. They just don't have as much shit to be scared of. There's not as many turn cards that are bad for them. If they have a very strong hand here, ace 9 or pocket 7s or something like that, they don't necessarily have the incentive to bet big to protect their hand because they just don't have a lot of turn cards to be scared of. So we can't glean as much information from the small size on a static dry board. So we're not just going to go willy-nilly with the check raising and go crazy. Of course, when we do have this kind of can play for stacks hand, of course we are check raising. But if we had a hand like ace king here for thick value, would just be check calling. If we had a hand like jack 10 suited here for a low equity draw, would also just be check calling. We're getting a very good price, would love to see a turn. Don't want to be check raising against a range that can still have quite a few strong hands in it because our opponents just aren't going to telegraph nearly as much when the board is static and dry. All right, so now let's put some of these pieces together. Button opens, we're gonna 3-bet with the jack 10 of spades. We get called. Jack 7-4, we would ask, is it likely to get stabbed? I would say yes here, so we're gonna be doing a lot of checking. We face a big stab. With a hand that's kind of in the thin value range, we are going to be check calling here, consulting our handy dandy chart, facing a big stab. Now we go to the turn, and we are going to turn 2 pair here. And so what are we going to do on this turn? Well, thankfully, we've got a chart for this, so let's consult. So let's see, how do we play turns after check calling on the flop? So the first question we ask, what size did they stab on the flop, big or small? Where our opponent stabbed big on this flop, 150. And so we see here, we're going to go to this side of the chart. What is our hand? Well, I would say at this point, we probably have a can play for stacks hand. Sure, a hand like 8-9 gets there. We have a very, very strong hand that can cooler our opponent if they have a hand like ace jack or pocket queens. We're just ahead of a whole hell of a lot. Very comfortable just getting the money in. So we see here, we are just going to check raise when we have a can play for stacks hand. We check, our opponent goes 300 and may just put in the money here when the board is so wet and dynamic. If we did turn a big combo draw here, a hand like king, queen of clubs would also just be check raising here. Remember, don't think we have a whole lot of fold equity when our opponent stabs big on the flop and then follows up with a double barrel, but we have so much equity in our hand. Even if we have just a smidge of fold equity, still going to print because we're just going to get there a lot of the time. So we'll be check raising with king, queen of clubs. Hand like pocket queens, a thick value hand, would just be check calling here. And a hand like ace 5 of clubs, the nut flush draw, high equity draw, consulting our chart, high equity draw, just going to go for a check call here as well. All right, but what if we check to our opponent on the flop and they stab for a small size instead of a big size and we call, and now we turn this kind of can play for stacks hand. So back to our chart here, what size did they stab on the flop? Well, they went small. And now we see there are some differences here, and we see we have a donk option, which means a lead option, just coming out and betting ourselves on the turn. And we want to do this with can play for stacks and thick value hands. So why do we want to come out and donk ourselves? When our opponent stabbed big on the flop, we wanted to check and go for that check raise and just pile in all the money. Well, remember, it's going to be all about our opponent's range. And when they stab small on a wet dynamic flop, their range is going to be much, much weaker. And remember, we think they're going to be massively under double barreling turns for thin value and as a bluff. So that means their range is just going to be much weaker. Now, the best way to capture value from a weaker range is to minimize fold equity. And the best way to minimize fold equity is just come out and lead ourselves, right? And if our opponent's going to be under bluffing, if they're just going to give up with their air balls here, we're not really missing out on value against the bluff portion of our opponent's range. And if our opponent's just going to check back a hand like pocket 9s here or 7-8 suited, we're not really missing out on value from that by checking, but our opponent may call a bet, even a sizable bet on this type of draw heavy board if we just come out and lead ourselves. So that's why when our opponent stabs small on the flop, we want to just be doing a lot of leading on the turn when we make a can play for stacks hand. But let's say same spot, except now we turn a combo draw. Going back to our chart, we see the combo draw wants to go for a check raise. So why did the can play for stacks hands and thick value want to come out and lead, but the combo draw wants to go for the check raise? Well, the combo draw wants to maximize fold equity and also possibly just see another card for free. Let's think about what happens if we check when we have a combo draw here, right? If we check and our opponent checks back, well, we could have the best hand with 7x here, and we just get to see the river for free, which is a pretty good scenario. We're ahead of all his bullshit stabs with ace high or queen high or whatever they stabbed with on the flop when we have a pair of 7s. And if our opponent does come out and bet here on the turn, remember, the best way to maximize fold equity is to go for the check raise, particularly on the turn. We're going to apply a lot of pressure to a weaker range, and we're just going to be able to get a lot of folds. So if it goes check, check, pretty good for us. And if our opponent stabs, well, now we can try to check raise and maximize fold equity. So that's why a combo draw here would want to go for that check raise, whereas a can play for stacks hand may just want to come out and donk itself. All right, so that's how to play flops out of position in turns after facing either a big stab or a small stab. And of course, there is still, how do we play turns after we check raise? How do we play turns after the flop goes check, check? And once again, that is the kind of sauce we save for our 5-day base camp. It's 5 days of intensive coaching where we teach you in position, out of position, pre-flop, and help you come to a good decision in 3 questions or less, all built from 50,000 hours of data. If you want to level up, this is the sauce. This is how you do it. Now, of course, you're watching this video, you're here, you're taking poker seriously. You could probably get there on your own. A lot of players do get there on your own, but Basecamp is the fast forward button, allowing you to save 3 years, 5 years, 10 years of doing all this digging, all this practice on your own. We could just speed up that process and save you a lot of time and money. So the 5-day Basecamp, that's where we go over all of the sauce. So look, we like to make our free shit better than everybody else's paid shit, but we have to save some of that sauce for the vault, and Basecamp is where you get all of that sauce. All right, now let's move along to in position. We're gonna give away quite a bit here. I'm gonna show you how to play flops, turns, and rivers all the way through a hand. 3-bet pots in position. Let's go. All right, so flops here. Villain opens. We're gonna 3-bet on the button. Villain is going to call. They check it over. And here's my shortcut for 3-bet pots. I'm generally just going to c-bet my entire range, choosing a small size, the size where they're going to fast play their strong stuff and call with their weak stuff. Now, generally in a 3-bet pot, that's going to be a smaller size relative to the size of the pot. And if I go 90, 100, 110 here, our opponents may start trapping some of those hands at a much higher frequency. You see, if we're in a single raise pot here, we open on the button, our opponent calls, we may be able to get away with half pot, maybe even 2/3 pot, 30, 35 here, and still get our opponent to fast play all of their strong hands. But in a 3-bet pot, since the absolute size of the pot is bigger, the money is getting a little bit scarier. In a 3-bet pot, we have to choose a smaller size relative to the size of the pot to accomplish that goal of getting our opponents to raise with the strong stuff and call with the weak stuff. So single raise pot may go half pot, 2/3, something like that. 3-bet pot may go closer to 1/3 or 40%, something like that, to still accomplish that goal. And you may have seen some of these spots in single raise pots. Let's say we 3-bet on the button here. I've talked about some of these spots before where I'm playing a big bet or check strategy in a single raise pot. In a 3-bet pot on this board, again, I am just going to be c-betting my range, and there are a couple of reasons for this. So you see here, same situation, single raise pot, we open, our opponent calls, and this is the spot where I'm playing big bet or check in these single raise pots. And my reasons here are numerous. Number one, our opponents are just going to have way too much ace-x garbage in their range. Hands like ace-4 offsuit, ace-5 offsuit. They just have literally hundreds of combos of top pair here in a single raise pot. Number two, they're just not going to fast play all that often on this board. Even when they have a super strong hand like pocket 7s or pocket deuces, they just don't really have the incentive. They're not really scared of much. Whereas in a 3-bet pot here, sure, our opponents still may not fast play when they have a super strong hand like 7s or deuces, but there's a couple things going on here. Number one, they have way fewer combos of top pair. And number two, their range is just much more heavily weighted towards pocket pairs in a 3-bet pot. Hands like pocket 8s, 9s, 10s, jacks, queens, etc. And a lot of those hands we're just going to be able to get to fold by the turn or by the river. And finally, number three, what hand do they put you on in a 3-bet pot?
Well, I think he has ace-king.
So even if they do have an ace, a hand like ace-jack, ace-10, ace-5 suited, a lot of the time we're going to be able to make those hands fold by the river on such a static and dry board just because they put us on ace-king. It's hard for them to put us on a bluff on this board. And when we do run into a super strong hand like 7s or deuces, at this SPR, it's way less of a mistake to go bet, bet, bet and put in all the money and get snapped off by a set or 2 pair. If that happens occasionally, well, all right, congrats, man, you get the money. But when in a single raise pot, when the SPR is 1,000,000, it's a huge punt if we just pile in a ton of money and our opponent traps with 7s or deuces. So again, 3-bet pots, they just have more pocket pairs. They have way less top pair. They're going to put us on ace-king, and we may even be able to get them to fold a lot of ace-x by the river. And it's just way less of a concern when they do have a trap in a 3-bet pot because the SPR is so low. So it's just less of a giant mistake when our opponent does trap and ends up with 7s or deuces or whatever in a 3-bet pot as opposed to a single raise pot. All right, let's talk about how to play turns. This one we have 7-6 of diamonds. We're going to 3-bet. Cutoff's going to call. We go to a flop. Remember, just c-betting my range here, and our opponent calls. We go to a turn, which is the innocuous 4 of diamonds. By the way, guys, I know a lot of you come to these videos because of my hair, and I'm really sorry to let you down today, but Liz is out of town, so I had to do it myself. I'm sorry it does not live up to its usual standards, and I had to let you down. What do we do here? Well, let's go to our handy dandy chart. We are going to ask first, always, what is their range? Let's go back to our board. Well, they check called on the flop. Are they capped or are they uncapped? Well, because this board is static and dry, do think they can have some traps like nines, like deuces, like ace nine, ace deuce, etc. So I would say our opponent is uncapped. Will they fast play their strong stuff if we continue to bet here? Well, again, the board is static and dry. Even if they have a hand like nines or deuces, I think they could still slow play some of the time. So we see here, will they fast play the strong stuff? Answer is no on this board. What is our hand? Well, we have a bluff. We have 7 high, and we see here in this spot, we want to check. So we would just check back with 7 high here. And this doesn't mean we're giving up, right? If our opponent comes out and checks the river, not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but now our opponent would be capped and we can start applying a ton of pressure. If our opponent comes out and just bets the river, they're just never going to be able to help themselves when they have nines, deuces, ace nine, whatever. They're just going to come out and bet the river for a big size and we can just fold. And when they check the river, well, now we can come out and run the bluff and get them to fold weak hands like 9x or pocket 10s or pocket jacks or whatever that called the small bet on the flop. What if we have a super strong hand like pocket 9s on this turn? Going back to our chart, what is our hand? We have value, so we would want to go big. Remember, if our opponents aren't going to fast play, we just need to put the money in for them. And if we do have showdown value, we see we're checking. So back to our hand here, if we have a hand like pocket kings for showdown value, pocket queens, we would just be checking back on this turn as well as our bluffs. All right, next one, we're gonna c-bet on the flop. Look at that sweet baby there. Our opponent is going to check call. We go to a turn, which is a 3 of spades. Going to our handy dandy chart, what is our opponent's range? We'll go back to this board. Can they have some flushes here? The nuts change. Well, sure, they could have king X of spades, queen X of spades, 6, 7 of spades, something like that. They could have flushes here. So they are uncapped. Will they fast play strong stuff? Well, yeah, right? If they have a 7 high flush and 8 high flush, they don't want to see a bad card. So yes, they're going to fast play their strong stuff. What is our hand? We have value. We want to go small here in this spot because when we go small, our opponent's going to check raise for us when they have a hand like an 8 high flush or a queen high flush. And also, if we have our opponent drawing dead, if they have a hand like pocket 10s with a spade or ace jack or something like that, we would hate for them to fold here. And by going small, we get their weak stuff to call, we get the strong stuff to raise. Win-win. Everybody wins except them. They don't win. What if we had a hand like 10s here? Well, back to our chart. What's our hand? Showdown value. So we see here on the turn, we would just be checking if we had a hand like pocket 10s. What about a complete airball? A hand like 8-7 of clubs. So back to our chart. What's our hand? We have a bluff. We would go small here again with 8-7 of clubs. Nice thing about going small with a bluff, our opponent's going to put in more money with their flushes a lot of the time for us, and they're going to call with a bunch of weak stuff like pocket 10s or 9x or jack X that we can get to fold on the river quite a bit because the flush got there. So if our opponent check calls after we bet here with a bluff, we're just going to have the green light to fire on the river. We're going to talk about rivers more in just a few moments. All right, next one, we're going to 3-bet, of course. Our opponent calls. We're going to c-bet on the flop. They call. We go to a turn. Over to our board now. What is our opponent's range? Well, in this spot, they are capped. Why are they capped? Going back to our board, because the board is wet and dynamic. If our opponent had a hand like queen 9, pocket 9s, pocket 6s, when we choose a small size on the flop, they're going to raise, and the turn does not change the nuts, so our opponent is going to be capped. So the next question we ask, going back to our chart, do they have inelastic hands? And inelastic simply means, do they have hands that are going to be price insensitive, that are going to call even if we choose a massive size, right? Are they going to be inelastic? Going back to this board, yeah, they may not raise a hand like queen X or an ace high flush draw or jack 10 or something like that on the flop, but it doesn't mean these hands are ever folding on the turn. So even though they're capped, they're still going to be inelastic. So we see here, what is our hand? We have value. We want to go large here on this turn. And again, if we had a hand like showdown value, a hand like pocket jacks, we would want to be checking here to use my favorite line in poker, c-bet the flop, check back the turn, and then bluff catch on the river if our opponents choose a smaller size. So showdown value, a hand like pocket jacks, 9x, something like that, would just want to check back on this turn. What about if we had a bluff here on this turn? We see our bluffs want to go big as well. Now, there is a caveat here, especially in 3-bet pots. Sure, our bluffs want to go big, but our bluffs want to choose the biggest size where we can still keep an appropriate SPR where we have that big chunky overbet on the river. So while the value may want to go 280 here to set up a smaller SPR on the river, our bluffs may want to choose the biggest size, maybe 180 here, where if our opponent calls, we still have that big chunky overbet behind. This may not be a spot where I would choose the big size on the river, but we're going to talk about rivers in just a second. The important point here is on the turn, we leave our options open for the river. We're planning ahead for that that river and sculpting the SPR. So we do have the option of choosing that big boy size on the river, even if we sometimes decide to use the scalpel on the river instead of the jackhammer. Just leaving ourselves the option is good to plan ahead. All right, let's look at this one. We got Kiglies. We're going to 3-bet. Our opponent calls. We're going to c-bet small. Now we're going to go to the turn, which is a king, and our opponent checks it over. Let's go to our chart. What's their range, capped or uncapped in this spot? Well, let's go back to our board. Let's say we're against an aggressive opponent who would fast play whenever they have 4s or deuces. Even if they would trap 9s some of the time, they're going to be mostly capped. If we're against a super passive or sticky opponent, they would trap all their sets, so they would be uncapped in this spot. It's going to be player dependent. Going back to our chart, if we're against a super passive guy, they're going to be uncapped. Will they fast play? Well, if they're not going to fast play on the flop, the board is still static and dry, they may not fast play here, so the answer would be no. But let's say we're against a more typical player. They're not going to be super trappy when the board is dry because it is a little bit dynamic. But remember, this is all about asking good questions. It's not about following some flowchart rigidly, blindly. You need to be asking the questions in order to come to a good decision. Let's say our opponent is capped here. We'd ask, do they have inelastic hands? And going back to our board, it's kind of hard to find the inelastic hands when we have a hand like kings specifically. Most of their hands are going to be hands like 9x, ace-5 suited, pocket 10s, jacks, queens, stuff like that. So going back to our chart here, yeah, I guess they could have an inelastic hand or two, but most of their range, which is what we're concerned about, most of the range is going to be elastic. Going back to this board, if we bet too big on this turn, queens are going to fold, ace-9 is going to fold, right? So we're going to say no, they don't have a lot of inelastic hands. What is our hand? We have value. We want to go small here to make sure our opponent calls with hands like ace-5, ace-3, ace-4, ace-9, pocket queens, jacks, 10s, etc. And if we do have a hand like 6-5 of diamonds here, same thing. We want to drag our opponents to the river with hands like 9x or jacks or 10s, because if we can get those hands to the river, we're going to have a much more profitable bluff. If we go big here with a hand like 6 high and then our opponent calls, well, their range getting to the river is going to be king x plus, and I don't feel good about making that range fold on the river. So you see here, often our value and our bluffs want to have the same plan on the turn, and then they diverge on the river, but same plan on the turn, because with both our value and our bluffs, we want them to call. With the bluffs, we want to get them to fold on the river. With the value, we want to get them to call on the river, so that's where we diverge, but on the turn, same goal. All right, let's do rivers, because rivers are fun. All right, we got ace-4 of clubs. We're gonna 3-bet. We're gonna c-bet on this flop. Our opponent calls. We go to a turn, going to our chart. What is our opponent's range? They are going to be capped. They are going to have inelastic hands. So we're gonna choose a big size here on this turn. We see we started deep, so we can choose that big boy size and still have a favorable SPR on the river, but we're gonna get there on the river. And now when our opponent checks, let's go through the river process. What is our opponent's range? Well, back to the board, a flush came in. Could our opponent have flushes? Sure, they could have flushes here, so they are uncapped. Will they fast play the strong stuff? We're against most opponents. Yeah, they're gonna put in more money if they have a king high flush, even a 10 high flush or something they got there on this river. If we choose a smaller size, they'll put in more money for us, right? So here, what is our hand value? We want to go small here on this river because we want weak queen X to call, a hand like queen jack, queen 9 suited, something like that. And also when we go small, our opponent will put in more money for us when they have a flush. And if we do have a bluff here, a hand like jack 10 of spades, well, you see here, what's our hand bluff? We want to go medium. Why would we want to go medium when we have a hand like jack 10 of spades? Well, because if we go small, queen X calls and the flushes raise. And if we go big, well, the flushes call and everything else folds. But if we go medium, if we can find that sweet spot where we can maybe get hands like queen X, pocket jacks, pocket 10s, pocket 9s, we can get that stuff to fold. We're going to get snapped off by the flushes, but that's okay, because if we find that medium size, maybe it's 450, 500, something in that ballpark here on this river when we have jack high, going to have a very profitable bluff. Just getting top pair, 8x, pocket 9s, getting that stuff to fold is going to print for us in this spot on the river. All right, let's say same spot, except now the SPR is much lower and we're against a player named Nitty Ned. This guy's just never going to put in more money for us if he has a 9 high flush or 10 high flush or something like this on the river, but that doesn't mean he's going to fold to a big bet. So back to our chart here. What's their range? Uncapped. Will they fast play? No, he's not going to put in more money for us. What is our hand value? We would just want to go big with our value because this player's not going to put in more money for us. All right, let's look at another. We got Kiglies again. We're going to c-bet. Our opponent calls. We go to a turn. What is our opponent's range? Well, they are capped because they would fast play their strong stuff on this wet dynamic board. They're inelastic. They got a lot of queen X flush draws that aren't folding no matter what. We go big. Our opponent calls. We go to the river. And now, what is their range? Well, they are still capped. Sure, technically 5-7 got there, but but who cares? It's one combo, 7-5 of spades that may play this way some of the time. Our opponents are mostly capped. Do they have inelastic hands on this river? Let's go back to our board. It depends upon how much money is behind. See, the pot is 847. We've got 580 effective. Do we think our opponent's folding hands like Queen X here for all the money? Well, probably not. That means that, yes, our opponent does have inelastic hands. So what is our hand? Value. Value here wants to go big. We just want to put in all the money with pocket kings because our opponent's going to be inelastic with Queen X. So what does that mean when we have a hand like Jack 10 of diamonds here? Well, back to our chart, our bluffs want to go small. Maybe we can just go 250 here, 280, right? Same size bet. And we can get our opponents to fold. Ace X of spades, King X of spades. So we're going to have a profitable, very, very small bluff when we have a hand like Jack high or 7 high or something like that in this spot. Bluffs just want to go small. And we see here on the river where the bluffs and value start to diverge. Let's look at another one. Queen Jack of hearts this time. We're going to see bet on the flop. Our opponent calls. We go to a turn and our opponent checks it over. What is our opponent's range? The board is somewhere between dynamic and static. Let's call it dynamic, but the board is also very, very wet. So I do think our opponent would fast play quite a bit on this flop. Getting to the turn, I would say our opponent is mostly capped. The 6 isn't going to change much in a 3-bet pot, right? Do they have inelastic hands? Yes. So what is our hand? A bluff going big here. See, the value would also want to go big here. Same goal with the bluff and the value on this turn. We go to a river, which is the innocuous deuce of hearts. Again, what is our opponent's range? They're capped. Do they have inelastic hands? Aha. And this is where the nuance comes in. So let's go back to our hand here. We see we've got 2x pot behind. And if I put a musket and put it to your head here and said, if you had ace king instead of queen jack of hearts, how big would you go with ace king here to try to get your opponent to call if they had ace queen, ace jack, ace 10, something like that? And I'd be willing to bet a whole hell of a lot of money that most of you would not go all in here with ace king because why? You think ace queen or ace jack would fold. Aha. So that opens up the door here. That means our opponent doesn't really have the inelastic hands here on this river because we've got so much depth behind. So what's the range? Capped. Do they have inelastic hands? Mostly no. What is our hand? We have a bluff, so we want to go large here. We would just put in all the money in this spot. We think we can get almost all their ace X to fold. And sure, occasionally we'll get snapped off by ace deuce suited or ace king rarely on this river. But if we can get most of their hands to fold, this is going to print. Conversely, if we had ace king in this spot, what is our hand? Value. We want to go small. And again, small is just a starting point. It doesn't mean we want to go 200 here or 300 here or something like that. We would just ask, what's the biggest size that a hand like ace queen, ace jack, ace 10 would call? So if we had ace king here, maybe we want to go small, something like 800, 900 on this river to try to get called by the ace queen. Again, probably would not be going all in with ace king here because we think our opponent would fold hands like ace jack, ace 10, ace 5 suited to a jam on this river. So the small size may just be pot or slightly under pot, something like that. All right, guys, once again, if you want all of the sauce for pre-flop, in position, out of position, you want more like this built on 50,000 hours of data and you want to level up quick, that's what our 5-day Basecamp is for. Either way, hope you enjoyed this video and it turns you into the biggest boy possible. Thank you guys and have a gentle